to use before we go there, to thank Silas and Hildur Fjóla for their collaboration and participation and insight. Because now we have different focus that is titled Editor's Discussion, Knowledge Production in the Field of Gender-Based Violence. And there will be a short introduction to the book that I mentioned in the beginning, the Handbook on the Politics of the Me Too Movement. And I call on Gitti Chandra to give an introduction to that publication. And when she feels ready, Maya Lundquist will join her, and they will have a dialogue between them, the two of them, and focusing the intersectionality and the meaning of context in the regard of sexual harassment and gender-based violence. So we will take about an hour and then join the wonderful Icelandic spring when that's done. So, Gitti, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Hólmfríður, and thank you for steering this afternoon so wonderfully. So I'll just take a few minutes, maybe 8 or 9. I tried timing it. So that just a brief introduction to those of you who may not know about the handbook. So there are many wonderful things about the Routledge Handbook of the Politics of the Me Too Movement. But perhaps the most astonishing is that the grant application for a lecture series and a collection of 2 volumes in English and Icelandic about the movement went out in the spring of 2018, so just about 6 months after Burke's iconic phrase had gone viral on Twitter. And as the call for the books went out and the responses poured in, Routledge asked us to consider putting together a handbook because there was so much material. And we thought about the rapidity with which a movement like this one grows and progresses and changes, and how very, very difficult it would be to pull together 30 plus contributions and edit them and so on fast enough so that it didn't become outdated by the time that it went into publication. And it seemed to be an absolutely impossible task. And so, of course, Irma Erlingsdottir, who is the director of Guest and my co-editor, she said, Gitti, of course we must do this. And so we did. We signed the contract in the summer of 2019, and we delivered the completed, edited, peer-reviewed, revised, complete manuscript to Routledge in the summer of 2020. And it was launched in December of 2020. So among the many astonishing things about this timeline is the fact that Irma and I have survived to tell the tale. So I would like to guide you through this handbook, as the handbook itself does, through Cynthia Enlow's eyes, and she has written the foreword for the book. And in her foreword, she says that there are bright threads of similarity that run through diverse sites, yet multidimensional context matters. And it is this push and pull between the generalizable and the particular that presents the analytical challenge for doing research on and making useful sense out of the Me Too movement. And the potential theoretical reward comes with resisting the temptation to choose between only zooming out or only zooming in. And so we see this handbook as a work in progress, much like the movement itself. And in the 2 years succeeding the launch of the book, we have had podcasts based on it from the authors in conversation with each other. We've had lecture series coming from it. So we've tried to keep the conversation going and keep it a work in progress, considering that we are in an ever-shifting present and looking forward to the extension of current debates and the emergence of fresh and unforeseen discourses. So we recognize that any such discussion of such an area needs to be approached from several directions and perspectives at the same time in terms of themes, debates, and discussion, And each of the chapters touches on so many of these. So in the end, we divided the book into 3 broad sections. I should have had slides which would have made it easier for you, but nevertheless. In part 1, there are 9 chapters that are primarily theoretical. They cover the nature and needs of the feminist struggle, the contours of revolutions, the global and legal forces active in the movement, the many-faceted meanings of consent, the place of masculinity in the movement, the concept of vulnerability, the relationship between anonymity and personhood, the silencing of resistance to patriarchy, and the strengths and dichotomies of African feminisms. And part 2 contains 8 chapters that look at theoretical frameworks within distinct contexts. So the psychology and trauma attendant on the naming of crimes and perpetrators, the place of the survivor in revolution politics in post-colonial and church contexts, the movement from theory to praxis, the heteronormativity of the movement in specific non-binary contexts, the perpetrator question, solutions to workplace harassment in a post-Me Too era, an account and understanding of a woman with disabilities being a troublemaker amongst troublemakers, and a discussion of race and sexuality in the post-colonial subject situated in the UK. The third and the longest section reflects the global reach of the movement. While each of the 14 chapters in this section delineates the specifics of a particular country or region, they all have larger theoretical approaches and frameworks that define them and connect them to the other chapters. So part 3 begins with a sweeping survey of the ways in which the movement has traveled globally. It goes on to chapters from France, Poland, Russia, Romania, China, Japan, Egypt, and Middle East and North African countries, Kenya, South Africa, and other countries in Africa, Argentina, Mexico, and other regions of South America, and in the north, Sweden and Iceland. And of course, all of these local contexts foreground the very complex relationship between the Me Too hashtag and movement and local hashtags and movements already in place. So as editors, we recognize that feminist struggles have always been an extended conversation, forging ahead through dialogue or not at all. So in these chapters, the reader will find perhaps that the most valuable takeaway from the handbook are the many ongoing conversations. And as an act of respect and acknowledgement of our many contributors, I'm going to name each of them. So bear with me. So Jeff Hearn's concerns regarding the positioning of trans and non-binary genders is taken up in Jack Halberstam's blog post. Biblia Pavard, Florence Rochefort, and Michelle Zancarini-Fournel gesture towards the place of romance and seduction in French culture, an idea that is explored in detail in Anne-Emmanuelle Berger's analysis of seduction and consent. And Nkiru Bolonwu's careful placing of the contradictions within African feminisms extends this notion into a discussion of the feminist controversy surrounding erotic capital. Karen Boyle's investigation into the importance of the Weinstein case follows from Catherine McKinnon's exposition of the legislations that underpin a contemporary understanding of sexual harassment and speaks directly to Audrey Ruffey's interrogation of the efficacy or lack thereof of workplace harassment complaint mechanisms. Nana Hlin Halldórsdóttir's discussion of neoliberal uses of invulnerability provides an interesting perspective on my chapter's consideration on the vulnerability and anonymity of the construction of personhood. While Lisa Salmonson's and Vinita Chandra's account of feminist resistance to gender-based violence in the context of the university meet in theory and practice from quite different parts of the world. And indeed, they can both be read within the theoretical framing of Ea Brynjarsdóttir's discussion of resistance. In many of the chapters, sociocultural spaces offer points of contact and departure, allowing for an interpretive and multifaceted reading of the movement. So Mirella David's comparative study of Romania and China as post-socialist societies provides context and framing for Li Jun's study of student creativity and perseverance in the face of stringent political control in China. Robert O'Mulcain's examination of the Japanese ethos and its tentative steps towards confronting sexual harassment finds an unexpected echo in Magdalena Grabowska and Marta Ralushko's account of the Polish context, and Anna Sedesheva's reservations regarding the future of the movement in Russia. First-person narratives seem almost to be in actual conversation with each other. So Reem Tina Ghazal's stories of being a woman journalist in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Rochelle McPhee's testimony as a survivor, Marai Larasai's standing witness to the oppressions of women of color in the UK all carry the inflections and poignancy of the personal while communicating the urgency of the collective. Perhaps one of the most animated conversations the movement has created is between grassroots local movements and received global ones. So for Kay Kanyali Mwikya, Judy Gitau and Esther Waweru, and Tamara Sheffer and Tigist Hussein from different parts of Africa, to Marie-Fran Carlson and Edme Dominguez in South America, the lively debate of how and to what extent local hashtags and struggles gain from movements like the Me Too movement is a fascinating dialogue. And finally, from the general to the particular, the chapters by Angela Davis, Cass Sunstein, Purna Sen, and Irma Erlingsdotter encourage the reader to constantly keep the individual in mind when thinking about the collective. So these are just a very few of the ways in which these chapters speak to and with each other, and in that spirit, this handbook is an invitation to engagements, discussions, and debates, furthering our understanding of the movement and furthering of the movement itself. So that's my very brief introduction to the book, and I'm hoping that with Maya, who is here, we will cover other issues that, as editors, we came up with. And again, Irma is not well, she's not able to be here, so I will say Irma and I for everything, and we will keep her presence here. Thank you. There we go. It's okay if we just speak into this for the purposes of, all right, great. So we had a meeting, Maya and Irma and I, and we thought about how we wanted to do this conversation. So I have some notes that we can look at, but just to get the conversation going, I was wondering if we might talk about representation. So you talked about it in your account of the book as well. And I know that Irma and I had many, sometimes contradictory thoughts about the whole process of representation. So do you want to go first, just what went through your head and your co-editors' heads, of course?
Yes. Yes, I can do that. I would say that, I mean, of course, representation is, it can mean a lot of things. And for us, we discussed it mainly about, in regard to what kind of theoretical perspectives and what kind of concepts are represented in this book, rather than specific regions, except for the Nordic region as a whole, specific regions or specific groups in society or specific understandings of sexual harassment. So we were really interested in trying to find researchers and writers that could write about and or include sexual harassment in their ongoing research, to be able to see what happens when their perspective, when their theoretical perspective or their methodology is used to also discuss and understand sexual harassment. Yeah. So that was mainly our discussion about representation, or that's not our discussion. That's where we ended up.
Those are your decisions. That
was our decision.
At the end of lots of discussion,
yes,
I'm sure.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, I think that for the handbook, we were really thrown in at the deep end. Mm-hmm. Because it's a handbook, we were supposed to be representative. Mm-hmm. And part of the impetus behind the handbook also came from the 2019 conference of the Me Too movement that was held here in Reykjavik. And while we were helping organize this conference, we literally thought that we had covered everything and everybody that we could absolutely think of. And it was an effort that we made. We didn't want to inadvertently leave someone or something out. And then I think it was on the second day of the conference, we found these pamphlets when we came in. And they said, you have left out body imagery, you have left out fat people. And so we were mortified. We said, well, we will distribute your pamphlets. Here's the mic, here's the stage. Take 15 minutes, talk to everyone about it. My point is that even when you try really hard with the best of intentions, somebody gets left out. And so one of the things we did with this is that I actually made a checklist. Yeah. And it sounds like box ticking, and in a way it is, because I did want to make sure that we didn't leave anyone out. But it was not a box ticking exercise in the sense that it was not tokenism. We actually really wanted to. There were some countries, some regions of the globe that we did not get anything out of. We tried reaching out to people, and it was a very quick exercise. In a year, we did everything. But that was, I think, the hardest part of organizing the book in terms of themes and, debates and countries and different things happening in different countries. In some countries, nothing happening at all. We wanted to know why is nothing happening at all, or what is happening that we can't see, and so on. So that was.
But could you also say something about the question of language? Because
Oh God, yes.
I mean, these two books are, they're covering or discussing the same topic, but also in a very different ways. And our book has the Nordic region as context, and also the decision to publish in English. Yeah, I would like to hear a little bit how you discuss that.
Yeah, of course the language had to be English. It's Routledge and it's a handbook and so on. It has to be in English. But we recognized very quickly that that for almost 50%, if not more, of our contributors, English was nowhere near their first language. For some, it was a third, if not fourth. And editorially, I must say that this was a very complex thing. While recognizing that English is not their first language or even their most comfortable one or something, it was not just a question of churning out correct English, but in the process, what were you doing to the content? There were all kinds of decisions that we had to make editorially to say how fair are we being to the actual content of a particular chapter if we have to, I won't say rewrite, but I would say heavily edit a lot of what we were getting. That was an issue. And also Angela Davis mentioned this in her speech at the launch, and she said she would like to see it in translation. And that actually focused on one of the problems that we had with bringing out a handbook in the first place, because it's very expensive. And it's not available in open form, as yours is, which I think is a fabulous thing. And if we are extracting this knowledge from activists and academics, from a movement that was not academic run, then what do we mean by bringing out some really expensive academic tome and putting it in libraries? And shouldn't it be accessible to people? Shouldn't it just be cheaper? Shouldn't it be in languages that are more, read around the world than English? And unfortunately, that just still remains a sad reality. I don't think it's even out in paperback yet. I don't know. It is. Thank God for small mercies. Yeah, and translating it is a whole different exercise and demands lots of money, and I don't know if it's ever going to happen.
And what languages should it be translated to? It's contributions from a lot of different
Yeah.
countries.
I mean, I would say, at least for instance, Humfrida can tell me better, but in the Latin American countries, certainly Spanish would be a really good idea. Yeah, among others, I don't know. It's not even something we've. Have you thought about having this translated into?
No, we haven't actually.
It's just come out. I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
of
yeah,
course.
yeah. We'll keep it like this for a while. But I mean, I do think language is an important and interesting thing to discuss in regard to like knowledge production and who is to be like a knower in the field, and what kind of language are you. What kind of language can you use to make yourself understandable? And so I mean, it's obviously a very big question. But I think also that what we done, and I think that you have that as well in your book, is this mix between different formats of texts, which is also a different way of working with language, even though it's not translations between different languages, but still the format and to not only have the more like heavy theoretical academic chapters is also a different way to let the language be part of the knowledge production in the field, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I really think translation is a big issue for us, partly because this idea of knowledge being produced in English is just, I don't know, decolonially, it's not a great look for us. But we did also want, as you did in yours, to have a mix of, the kind of people who actually contributed to the movement. So first-person accounts and survivor accounts and things from activists, blog posts, things like that, along with reports. So different kind of genres. But I think editorially, one of the things that was really interesting was in Marai Larasai's piece, and she is Jamaican British, and she had structured her, I can't even call it essay, but her contribution like a musical piece. So she had, it was a series of riffs. And in order to do that, she would begin with, each section with quoting from a song or a poem or something. And then her text would follow from that. And the editors were like, no, you can't do this. So we said, what can't we do? They said, this is not good publication practice. You have to cite this and that and the other. If you're using a quotation, it cannot be more than so many words. If you're using it as a prologue or epigraph, thank you, then it has to be an epigraph. And if it's an epigraph, then you have to do this. And if it's blah, blah, blah. And so in the beginning, I had a chat with Mariah, and she said, all right, well, let's see what we can do, So she tried to rewrite things, and so finally I wrote to the editors, and I said, look, I mean, part of what we're trying to do is to give voices a platform. It kind of defeats that purpose if I'm going to rewrite that voice into academic, academies. And I have to say, they surprised us. They said, okay, we get it. Could you, we still had to, sort of do a little bit to fit it in, but they're like, fine, let her do this. So it was a little bit of negotiation. It startled me. And we wanted to think of the book as contributing or feeding back into the movement so that it would be accessible and it would sort of go back into the movement with fresh knowledge and so on. And it was partly keeping in mind the audience. So maybe, I don't know, what kind of audience were you thinking of for your book?
We are mainly thinking about researchers and in education, but also policymakers. And like in my introduction or in the beginning here, we want to talk about policy development and with policy people, but we're trying to find other ways to discuss change and policy development that doesn't kind of need, that doesn't always need the checklists and a kind of instrumental way of trying to deal with this social problem. Or that is also an audience, but then as well students and people interested in the question of sexual violence and harassment. So like a broader audience, and like I said, I hope that these shorter, more fiction or literary texts can also be like entry points for people that maybe hasn't read that much academic text or are new into that world. So
I
that's our hope.
find the fiction part of your book really interesting, because I think part of the Me Too movement was stories.
Yeah.
They were not fiction, certainly, but they were called stories. And there was a good bit of discussion, at least in the first year or so, about how these stories are being cannibalized. You know, researchers are jumping in and people are going in and everyone is giving their view of it, and then they're becoming instrumentalized and all of this. There was a lot of concern over how they were being consumed and used and so on. But one of the positive things was that there were stories. There were a way for people to immediately connect. People who knew nothing and cared nothing would immediately sort of see the main issue, because they saw it in story format as a narrative.
Yeah.
We thought of our audience in terms of the people who were actually making the movement. So bloggers and writers and the anonymous people on Twitter and so on. And so we made a clear decision to have writing that was accessible. So we said to all our contributors, could you please make sure that you write accessibly, even while expressing your very complex academic ideas. And in my cantankerous middle age, I feel strongly that if you write inaccessibly, then it's basically anti-feminist. If people cannot understand what you're saying, then really what are you doing here? And of course, as you say, for students, for people who are interested in the movement, we tried not to have chapters that were sort of really, that would date badly. So that even if it was a chapter that just said, well, this, just like a report or a survey of what is happening at the moment in some place, it would be tied to larger issues, to some analysis that will still be valuable for people reading it many years down the line, hopefully.
But that is, I think that it is interesting, and it's one of the big differences between these two books, that your book is about the Me Too movement, while our book is kind of having Me Too movement as a backdrop to the book, and a lot of the chapters kind of references the Me Too movement one way or the other, but we are kind of clear in the beginning that we do not engage specifically in the Me Too movement. So I think that's an interesting, I don't know if it has to do also, it's been a couple of years since you published that book or worked with that book, so the Me Too movement is, I mean, in a couple of ways, it's still very alive, and in different, I mean, in Denmark now, they had a really big Me Too movement recently, so it's shifting and changing, and it's still here in many ways, but it's not maybe that on top of everyone's mind now. So that was also a reason for us to keep the questions alive, because like I said in the beginning, we as organizations, when the Me Too movement started, were like kind of bombarded with these kind of questions for knowledge on sexual harassment, because that was now a topic. So this book is also a way of trying to just keep the topic alive, even when the movement is like this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that what we tried to do was to use Me Too as a lens with which to look through. And so some of the chapters, many of them actually talk about how, having like a top-down movement imposed on your region or your country or your community is actually harmful for local grassroots movements that have been there for decades. And So some of them, I think the chapter from South Africa, for instance, just says how actively harmful it is. Others say how, it actually rejuvenates local movements. It gives fresh energy. It sort of forges solidarities outside your own region and gives people, a sort of fresh shot in the arm. Some of them talk about just how technology is so much at the center of the Me Too movement. You have to have Twitter or Facebook or something to make it happen. But I think that also, it's used as a way of, I think Cass Sunstein's essay is really interesting because he's actually interested in the shape of revolutions, and he uses Me Too as a kind of case study, and he talks about how it may begin with one person, and at what point does it go from a protest to becoming a movement, and at what point does the movement then sort of feed into other things? And I like to think that that's what's happening now. That is that it's feeding into discussions about reformative justice and about the law and about the state. Angela Davis actually makes this very powerful statement, as we all know, about carceral feminism and so on. And so how it's actually doing what we want a movement to do, which is that it is changing structures, and so now you may not talk about Me Too, but you will talk about policy changes, and you will talk about how, maybe reformative justice is more center stage than it used to be or before the discussion, and so on. I don't know how we're doing for time, if someone is keeping track, but clock. Yeah.
Because it's just like us here. So if you have questions or comments or want to say something, please.
Even if it's left over from a past session.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm curious about, is there a Nordic common denominator? Is there a theme recurrent in, now that you study the situation in all of them? I spent a lot of time in Argentina, and when you look at the world from there, Nordic is one.
Yeah.
It's the same.
Yeah.
It's far away, and it's all the same. So,
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. Thank you. And this also has to do with the imagination, the ideas about the Nordic region, I would say. And in this book, I would say that what is the kind of common denominator or in the Nordic region or for the Nordic region is the discourse about gender equality that is very strong, but also as it's shown in, I would say, all of our chapters, that this discourse is also not true, or that it doesn't really represent the reality for people living in Sweden, in the Nordic region. But it can also be like an obstacle for trying to prevent, in this case, sexual harassment or sexual violence. But it's a very, very strong idea about the Nordic countries, both in the Nordic countries and from outside the Nordic countries. So we have chapters that discuss what it means to be the strong, independent Nordic girl, and how that affects your possibilities to react to sexual violence or to talk about it and to understand it as sexual violence. If you're strong and independent and can handle yourself, you're not supposed to be harassed. So it can actually be an obstacle. So this kind of gender equality discourse, I think it's interesting to think about in regard to issues of sexual violence and harassment. So in one of the chapter, Hetta Mulari's chapter, which is about public transportation in Helsinki, she has a writing where she says that in Helsinki or in Finland or in the Nordic, you are trusted to manage on your own as a young girl or non-binary, which are her respondents. And to be trusted to manage on your own, for me, that it really says something about the idea about the gender equality and what it does also to solidarity and to being able to understand your experiences because you're trusted to manage on your own. You're not. We have a gender equal society, but you still have a lot of experiences of sexual harassment in, for example, the public transport. But except for that, I think the Nordic region is very diverse. And people living in the Nordic region are very, it's a lot of people living here. I mean, it looks kind of empty sometimes, but there's still enough people living here for it to contain a lot of different experiences. So no, and I think that's also one of the interesting things, because we use the Nordic region, but we also kind of end up with saying that we can't really use it as a universal, or like trying to take like best practices from the Nordic region and use it somewhere else. We can't even translate the best practices from maybe one region to another region. But that is, and I would like to hear what you think about that as well, with this global scope that you have, the universality of sexual violence and sexual harassment in relation to particularities and specific locations or contexts.
Yeah. It kind of ties into something I wanted to ask you, but I'll answer this first. I think perhaps not surprisingly, but still very movingly, there is just a common denominator across the globe. If there is one thing that ties us all together, it's that sexual harassment exists in disturbingly in the same forms everywhere. There is intimate partner violence, and there is harassment on public transport, and there is any other given kind that you can think of. It exists in any given country that you can put your finger on. There is, sadly, if there's one thing that is universal, it seems to be gender-based violence. So there is that. Of course, the particularities change, how we understand it. One of the things that was really interesting that sparked my own work in this area was one of the lists that came out in India, lists of perpetrators. And what was surprising to almost everyone, and I'm really not sure why, is that all the men mentioned on the list were from left-wing institutions who identified as feminists and so on. And so there was even at one point a kind of sense that this looks like a conspiracy, why is it? Where are all the known right-wing offenders? And one of the things that people said was because, well, in certain institutions, they actually teach you what sexual harassment is. You recognize it for what it is. And culturally, at least in India, there is a really strong stream of, feeling that this is paternalism, this is how we are supposed to respond to older people, especially men, that you wouldn't recognize, you would not have a word for what happened to you, you wouldn't recognize it as harassment. And so, of course, culturally, there were differences, no doubt, but sadly, more universality than others. And on that note, I was thinking that, one of the things we don't talk about enough is the emotional labor that goes into this, not just the actual labor of bringing out, let's say in my case and Irma's, a handbook within a year, in your case, also sort of very, very intense work. But reading through this and sort of doing justice to it, keeping yourself open and vulnerable, but also going through the editing work that you're meant to do, is that something that, I don't know, that you have thought about, want to talk about?
Yeah, we actually, we did talk quite a lot about that in our editorial group, because that is really a work that needs some space as well, and some I'm very happy that it was 3 of us. I think 2 is better than 1, but it's still like you could, because it's really, it's difficult and heavy work as well. And I just said in the break here that, now when this book came out, and we were going to celebrate, and we were like, okay, so let's read one of the texts together, and then we'll, and you read it, and it's like really sad.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's terrible. It's not something that you read and then you go like, yay, what have you
Yeah.
done? It feels like it's heavy.
Yeah.
So I think that's a work that needs to be recognized as well as part of
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that really sharpened this for me was that when we tried to reach out to people that we really wanted to contribute, who had been sort of flashpoints of the movement in different countries, you could not reach these people. Because of the backlash, they had barricaded themselves. There was no way to get in touch with them. So I really wanted, for instance, Jessica Valenti to write. I wanted at least to ask her, where's the harm in sending out a letter and saying, please, would you do this? Moira Donegan, people who were in the beginning, who were real flashpoints for this, but there was no getting to them. And I thought about how, you were taking the generals off the field. And I remember when I thought this, I thought I'm using a war metaphor, and then I realized why. It was, you did wage war on these women, and they did have to retreat and barricade themselves so that they would be just safe. And so just the toll that, it took on people that then, of course, they were part of the movement, but it impacted us as editors. We're like, we want these people to write for this, but we can't because of the, emotional toll that it's taken from them. And that really bothered me a bit. So we wanted people that we couldn't have. But I have to say that on the positive side, I think what was wonderful about this is that everyone that we did reach out to, pretty much everyone, I can't remember anyone who actually said no. There was one person who wanted to know how much we'd pay her. But everyone said yes. And the only reason that we could bring this book out in the tiny, tiny space of time that we had was because everyone just wrote their stuff within a couple of months. I mean, you look for a call for books, it'll be, in 6 months send your abstract, then in a year you can send your thing, and then the whole thing takes 3 years. They wrote their stuff, they had it in within 3 months to us, they revised their things. I mean, considering that, when, for instance, I emailed Cass Sunstein, I said, Professor Sunstein, I need this, and this, and he, for someone so prolific, he would simply seem to be technologically challenged. And finally he said, Geeti, let me call in my assistant. And so Brenda came in, and Brenda showed him how to do various things. But the fact is that everyone really just, made way for our deadlines, and I was extremely impressed. I thought, wow, So that appreciation that just goes out to people who agree to contribute to this,
Yeah.
that was one of the highlights, I think, for me.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to think of something really wonderful and happy about this process.
It's too soon. No. No, it's been, but I have the same experience in many ways, and I also had the kind of idea beforehand, and that it would be really hard to get people to participate and to send their texts and to be, that it was some kind of an idea that it would be very difficult. But my experience is that it wasn't. People are really happy to contribute and to work with their texts. And I think for us, because one thing that helped that was that since we didn't really ask, you are an expert within sexual harassment, can you please write a piece on this? We needed to really explain. We needed to choose, and we needed to explain, like, why are we asking you? Because people weren't, working with intersectional perspectives on workplace violence. I'm not focusing on sexual harassment or sexual violence at all. And we were like, but we think that your perspectives on the issue of workplace violence and bullying and other types of harassment, would you be interested to also think about sexual harassment or sexual violence in regard to this, for example? So we needed to really think about why we asked the persons that we asked. And something that might as well have helped in like trying to get the right person. So we were also, I was really happy, and people, and I mean, two of them are sitting here, were really good and sending in their texts, and but I mean that's very important. Then we had, we were a bit naive of how it works to compile an anthology or an edition like this. I was just looking at our notes from the first meeting that we had, me, Kajsa, Angelica, and Elin, which we had in the beginning in January in 2021. And we had written that it should be published in November 2021. And we had like some, it's okay if we push it a bit back or forth, but we're aiming for November 21. That's 1.5 years ago. So I mean, it was like the time, yeah. And then the publisher came in and had their own, like, we need 6 months to produce this book. You know? So,
yeah. I think even Routledge sort of pushed us ahead because they saw how quickly we were coming back to them with things, and I think they also felt, as publishers, that it is a movement; it needs to come out now.
Yeah, it's an actuality.
And so for them, it may have been niceness, but it was also, I think, just the compulsions of their own marketing team that said if it's a movement, it needs to come out while the movement is still relevant before it gets outdated, and so on. Would anyone like to jump in if there's questions or comments? Or I'm asking because I kind of wanted to talk to this discussion. If you don't mind, I was just thinking about how with restorative justice, that what are we demanding from not just the victim but the community? And so, I mean, the idea of emotional labor that the victim and the community has to do seems to me to be, I mean, both disturbing and unreasonable. We're asking for, I don't know, are we asking for forgiveness? And is this yet another thing that the victim has to do now? Is to do that labor for the perpetrator? And the thing about forgiveness is it's always comes wrapped in the language of self-help. Do this for yourself. I tend to think, but this could be because I'm middle-aged and cantankerous, that anger is a good thing. And there are people who would rather not see our anger, and so they're like, do this for yourself, forgive them, self-healing. So, and for the community, what does it mean? I mean, I know you talk about space, Hildur Fjola, but also in terms of alternatives to carceralism.
Yeah. I think with restorative justice, I think, and Karen's probably done a very good job, in survivors in saying that this idea of forgiveness is not really, that's not the part necessarily of restorative justice at all. The whole key idea is for those responsible for violence and harm to take responsibility for their actions. That's kind of the core idea. And you're not really supposed to, at least if you have a specialized program for social violence, you're not really supposed to, as a facilitator, her and stuff like that. And then they had the meeting, and she said he used the whole meeting to explain to me how I had misunderstood his actions. So this was supposed to be a prepared meeting, and he was convicted. So, you know, very seemingly, in many cases, very, very rigid psychological structures, I think sometimes, that just inhibit the possibility of even taking responsibility. I think in many cases, it's literally a psychological construct. It's a psychological, just, you know. So I think that's, yeah, one aspect of it. But, yeah, did I answer?
No.
So I would, yeah, forgiveness is maybe, yeah, there's not enough discussion on that. I think that has done a really good job on that. That's not what it's about necessarily. But survivors often do talk about it. They want to forgive because then they can somehow cut the tie. Because violence creates such a strong tie, right? And often forgiveness is that cut.
No, I was just looking into the book. I hadn't read it before, and I started looking into the Jack Halberstam chapter, and they started out by saying something is rotten in the state of heterosexuality. And I think this is a core thing when you talk about forgiveness and community, because my impression of the straight community from the outside is that it's harder to talk about it as a community. It's just a couple or the family. And then the notion of community isn't there. But I think the restorative justice projects, they also, since they come from tighter communities, like racial minorities or queer communities, it is a community, and the person that committed the act is not going away. But if you are just a nuclear straight family, you can divorce the man and it's over. But if you are in this type of community that you want to keep, like it's not that easy, I understand that, but like it's such a straight conversation in many ways. And in the community that I live, we are a community, and we know that this person, someone told us this person did this, but this person is not going to go away. We have to deal with this person at a club or at whatever it might be, and we are all connected. Stockholm is a small town. The queers know each other. And then it's probably not on the person to forgive, but the community has to do the work of reintegrating that person. And I think as queers, we also think that it is not fruitful to just go with the majority thing of just expose the person, because that feeds into what the carceral feminism in Sweden is doing. Like, we deport the offender and then problem solved.
And this is
just send him back to where he came from.
Right, so this is obviously if he's an immigrant.
Yeah, but it's still like, since the policing is in Sweden is mostly in immigrant communities, you have more immigrant men convicted, even if that's not the most sexual violence. Like, the statistics are poor because of the policing and because of the public notion, and you can still, a black and brown man in Sweden will, to some extent, always be considered an offender in the eyes of the public. And then I think, again, it's not only rotten in the state of heterosexuality, it's also rotten in the state of whiteness and the white and straight state, again. And I think that from what I pick up from the straight feminisms is that the notion of forgiveness and emotional labor is put on the woman. And of course that's hard, but I still think that those dichotomies that heterosexuality and heterosexual ideology creates makes the conversation harder on restorative justice, because it becomes just, he's the bad one, you're the good one. And in smaller communities, we still, like, we can all be bad. It can always be like we misunderstood the communication, or you felt this felt wrong, whatever it might be, and how do we deal with this?
I think, can I say something?
Please, yes.
There are some of these smaller Icelandic communities, Greenlandic communities where I've worked quite a bit, where the violated, in most cases, woman has had to flee the small community because the community turned against her. She was just, inviting for that violation. And I just think it's only very, very recently that the kind of public discourse has shifted in supporting the violate. So I understand that a small community has to hold some stability in terms of negotiating things, but there must be limits. I feel. I mean, because otherwise we can also be nurturing incest just to keep peace, there must be some limits.
And I guess it's also just a question of community, because Johanna Niemi, she talked about, Johanna Niemi from Finland, Finnish Golden President, she talked about, I think she was doing when he was restored to justice some time ago, and her comment was also a little bit that, like, what is a community, and especially in Nordic countries, which are increasingly like highly individualistic, strong state. Your primary relationship is kind of supposed to be with the state. It's supposed to, so when something happens to you, what is this community? And I think different degrees and kinds of communities in the Nordic context. Because like you were saying, we're all supposed to be individualistic and in charge of ourselves and know how to handle ourselves and what we can kind of almost any support. Like there is this kind of individualism and other human rights-based individualism.
Also opposing community, like if a racial minority in Sweden will form a community, you would call it a clan in Swedish context. This is a clan-based network, very bad. Like we need to remove those. It's an actual saying going on in Sweden. It's very commonly used in the public debate that we have a problem with clan-based networks in Sweden, or families. And this is a way of like putting suspicions on community. I think it's also like you have to break up those communities and put the state in there. The social services need to monitor the children in here, and so even people who are trying to form and keep communities are being like you talk about it as something suspicious or violent even.
This is actually what we're seeing here in Iceland and in Icelandic statistics, that in rural areas here in Iceland, we get much fewer call-ins about violence against children because of the community. So the point about community is that it's like the village carries it on the back. We're not, we don't want to exclude anybody. Maybe he violated a child, but I work with his wife, or I have to meet his child during some social activities or stuff. So this is a problem.
I think Islamic society actually talks about itself very often in terms of plant-based communities, right?
But it would be a difference with it, like-
corruption actually thrives in plant-based communities. That's been argued.
No, but it would be a different if a clan-based community also belongs to the ethnic majority, or if it does not.
So ladies, I think we have a lot of ideas and research topics for the coming days, years, weeks, and months. I want to thank you, ladies, for sharing information about your new books and the importance of these studies, and your all input about what needs to be done never ends. So we always, and that's so important with sharing. I listen to you and I spent so much time in Argentina. They deal with it through psychoanalysis. Everybody has their psychoanalyst. I go there, I go to my best friend's psychoanalyst because everybody's doing it. And that's where you deal with all, the state is not there. It hasn't been for decades. Yes, you have friends, but you don't know who your friends are. No, if you lived under a military dictatorship, when everybody speaks, talks on you, you don't trust anyone except your psychiatrist. So that's where you go, and that's where you deal with gender-based violence. So you have a woman analyst in the case of women. Women talk to women, man to man. It's uncommon that it's so I think different communities, depending on their back, they will find solutions. They might not work for all, but I find it so interesting, and I've learned to appreciate it. But I want to thank all of you for sharing this afternoon with us, and especially the speakers for their interventions, their insights, resilience for not having given up on these hard topics, as you mentioned, that reading those articles is not easy. And the food for thought that you have contributed to all of us, and we will take and consider pondering for the upcoming weeks, months, years. What it has, I think, promoted, at least in me, is like an interest in looking into different directions, from what we have shared. And what is particularly pertinent in Icelandic context is that spring is here. The days are long. I woke up at 5 o'clock this morning. It was bright. And I came back home after a long work day at 10 o'clock last night. It was still bright. And that gives us energy, and we all know it. It promotes, you want to do more. So even if these complexities of justice and healing that I found so interesting in putting those two terms next to each other, and let's those two and many others guide our research in the next for the next book projects. So I want to mention that Rick runs a lecture series all the time. Now, this year, this semester, there is one on decolonizing different topics from different angles. So on Thursdays at midday, there are talks in this room, and they're open to all. And so please check on our homepage, webpage, and watch the upcoming ones. And the ones that I have heard, you can also watch them online, are extremely interesting and pertinent. Some in English, others in Icelandic, but please. So again, a round of applause for the thinkers. Thank you so much.